maybe we can take our attention now to how the multipolar world has been navigating this crisis in Gaza, the genocide in Gaza, also the growing lurch, or maybe just the already arrived endless war in West Asia. You have, on the one hand, you have China with this pretty incredible declaration that was signed in Beijing by 14 Palestinian organizations, Palestinian leadership organizations, resistance organizations, from Hamas, Fatah to the rest of the resistance. You also have, I mean, you've had Russia meet with the same groups. I think there was some coordination going on between Russia and China over the last several months to the last year. Several meetings between them of Palestinian groups, and then you also have Russia and Iran signing a strategic partnership. Rumors by U.S. intelligence very scared of it, that somewhere in that strategic partnership there's going to be arms to Yemen. And then you also have now Russia meeting with Bashar al-Assad of Syria as they begin to move toward Turkey-Syria potential peace talks. And of course, this comes on the heels of what I don't think I've spoken to either of you about on this channel, which is Saudi Arabia and Iran normalizing prior to all of these developments. So, there's quite the stark contrast here. How have you all been following these developments and understanding them?
Well, I think one of the most blatant things to notice is that China seems to be involved in creating peace pacts, while the U.S. is involved in obliterating people and sending weapons to drop on children. It's just such a glaring difference, even when it doesn't succeed, like it hasn't succeeded with Ukraine yet, but due to the U.S., etc. But it's still an effort to create peace in the proxy war in Ukraine. And so it's just such a glaring difference between the United States and China. China wants to use diplomacy. China creates business deals, and the U.S. basically just looks for ways to bend countries to its will, sometimes through straight-on assassination, sometimes through other coups, sometimes through lawfare coups, like in Pakistan, various ways. And then there's the economic wars. But the U.S. is just trying to bend every country to its will, while China facilitates peace and diplomacy for the most part.
Yeah, I mean, you both raised such important points. And Danny, you mentioned this increasing cooperation and partnership between China, Iran, and Russia. This is so important. And I should say that this is the ultimate historical irony, because the U.S. imperial strategist Zbigniew Brzezinski famously wrote in 1997 in his book, The Grand Chessboard, that the biggest threat to U.S. hegemony, U.S. unipolar dominance of the world, would be what he referred to as an anti-hegemonic alliance between, drumroll, China, Russia, and Iran, which is exactly what is happening. And as he pointed out in his book, which he wrote nearly 30 years ago now, he said that this anti-hegemonic coalition would not be based necessarily on, the same system or even necessarily the same ideology, but rather shared grievances. And that's exactly what we're seeing. Obviously, China and Russia have very different systems today, but they're very close partners. And certainly Iran has a very different system. Although I would point out that there are some similarities, especially economically. All three powers have maintained significant public ownership of their strategic national assets, including the banking system, including their natural resources. Let's not forget in Russia that although it is capitalist, it's no longer the Soviet Union, Russia does have a very resource nationalist economy, especially in recent years under Putin. There's been renationalization of the major natural resources. The largest company in the entire Russian economy is Gazprom, which is the state-owned gas giant. The biggest banks in Russia are state-owned, like Sberbank. And in Iran, this is also not talked about. Iran maintains a lot of state ownership, obviously, of the oil sector.
Oh, I think we lost Ben.
It might be a dramatic pause.
Oh, yeah. Sorry, you froze a bit.
Anyway,
you're back.
It looks like... Can you hear me?
I can hear you, Ben.
Hear you. You're frozen, though.
Your picture is frozen.
I lost them.
No, there he is.
Wait, coming back. This is U.S. economic war on Nicaragua.
Right. Yeah.
What's going
Yeah.
on?
Hey, sorry. Did you lose me? Could you guys hear me?
I
Yeah.
can hear you. Oh, now
Every
he's
time he says that, he freezes again.
Lee, if you want to pick it up, well, Ben.
Well, I can't possibly pick up on Ben's thoughts. They're too awesome. So, but no, we can talk about BRICS some if you'd like. It's such an important alliance, and of course, China and Iran and Russia are the linchpin to it, with Brazil coming in fourth, I guess. But yeah, it's incredibly powerful, and a lot of what we're seeing around the world is the U.S. fear of losing hegemony, but that also means fear of de-dollarization. The two go hand in hand, and we're just seeing so many countries that before didn't have the power or the will to stand up against the United States and Western empire, Western hegemony, are now doing it in so many ways.
Right.
Things like not signing on to the sanctions in the Ukraine proxy war, various African nations throwing out their colonial, leaders, or not leaders, but rulers, owners. I don't know what to call them, but and just so many countries are able to now stand up to the U.S. in a new, stronger way.
I think Ben. Good now?
Yeah, sorry, I lost you guys for a second. So I was saying, just to finish that train of thought, that what does, it's not just shared grievances, which is obviously U.S. imperialism, U.S. aggression and war. It's not just that brings together countries like China, Russia, and Iran. I mentioned, for instance, it's well known that in 1953 the CIA backed a coup that overthrew Iran's democratically elected prime minister Mohammad Mossadegh, because he nationalized the oil, and the US and also British intelligence wanted that oil to be privatized again by the Shah, the monarchy they reinstalled. But what's not often mentioned is that after the Iranian Revolution in 1979, they once again nationalized the oil. And today, Iran's oil is owned and produced by a state-owned company. So there are some commonalities aside from the ideological differences. But the point I want to get back to is that this issue of Eurasian integration, which was Brzezinski's worst nightmare, I mean, this is so important because we also see that these countries are not only pursuing independent paths of development, but they are not actually pushing for war. I mean, there's either like this ultra leftist talking point or like this liberal talking point. They say, well, like, what about Iranian imperialism or Russian imperialism, which is complete nonsense. They have no idea what imperialism actually is. Imperialism is centered on Wall Street. The United States is the leader of imperialism. It's a country having a foreign policy is not imperialism. Iran has provided support to countries in the region and peoples like the Palestinians who are defending their sovereignty against US-led imperialism. And the reality is that China maintained a very non-aligned policy for many decades because Deng Xiaoping had made this assessment, which ended up being, once again, an example of the strategic patience, which ended up being proven correct. He said, we must bide our time, said, lie low and bide your time, maintain a low profile, because China was in a catch-up stage of economic development, and he knew, and other leaders of the Communist Party of China knew, that if they poked the bear and provoked even more, of a response from the imperial powers, they were so weak that they could not defend themselves. China can now defend itself, and China is now playing a more activist role in its foreign policy. China never had a pro-imperialist foreign policy, but it did have a kind of non-aligned, non-interventionist foreign policy. And it's still non-interventionist in the way that it doesn't, invade countries or impose measures on them. But what China is now doing is stepping up and filling a void in support of international diplomacy and peace. Now, Russia has been doing that for many years, and that goes back to the Soviet Union. But this is actually a pretty new development in China. People have talked about it a lot in Beijing. And what we see now, as you mentioned, Danny, this historic rapprochement in 2023 between Iran and Saudi Arabia. This is absolutely historic in so many ways. First of all, it helps to stabilize the region because the US was trying to use Saudi Arabia to wage proxy war on Iran. The war in Yemen, which was ostensibly led by Saudi Arabia, but in reality, it was the US behind it. That was part of an attempt to try to isolate Iran by weakening some of its allies in the region. And in the process, hundreds of thousands of Yemenis were killed. This brutal war. Another important aspect of this, in addition to stabilizing the region, is, of course, Iran and Saudi are seeking alternatives to the US dollar. So this is a way that China as well is seeking more energy security. And it knows that if there's another kind of conflict, that the US could try to cut Chinese banks out of the SWIFT system, which would make it hard to process transactions involving the dollar, which would make it very difficult for China, being the world's largest importer of oil and gas, to purchase oil and gas in dollars. It would be very difficult. So China's been trying to find ways to purchase oil and gas from the Gulf. It's the largest customer now, the largest trading partner of the Gulf, not the US, which hasn't been for 10 years after the shale revolution in the US oil industry. So China is de-dollarizing its purchases of oil and gas. And now Iran and Saudi are at least invited to join BRICS. Iran has confirmed its offer. Saudi actually is once again kind of playing both sides and being very, ambiguous. They said that they were going to join, and then they actually said in February that they haven't joined and they're still considering it. But the point is that China opened up all of these new political, diplomatic, and economic possibilities through that normalization process. And it also made it clear to the forces in the region that although the resistance forces still, they're very suspicious of Saudi Arabia, rightfully, given its historical role, they can focus on the primary contradiction, which is the US and Israel. They don't have to focus as much on the secondary contradiction of what Ghassan Kanafani, the Palestinian revolutionary, famously referred to as the reactionary Arab regimes. His whole argument was that, it's not just the Israeli regime, but also Saudi, the UAE, Qatar, Jordan. But now what we see is that, at least in the short term, these other countries are, because they're trying to hedge their bets and maintain a non-aligned foreign policy, they would clearly kind of go along with whatever side is best for them. Now the resistance forces don't have to divide their energy and they can focus on Israel, which is what they're doing. So, there are these ultra leftists who criticize China and say, why isn't China just like sending a bunch of weapons to Palestine, blah, blah, blah. China is playing a particular political role that complements the role of the resistance. The resistance doesn't necessarily need more military support. They have a lot. Hezbollah is the most powerful military in the region. It's more powerful than the IDF. They don't necessarily need more technology and weapons. Of course, there's the Iranian military is the most powerful, but I mean, like in the Levant region, around
and furthermore, as you said earlier, China's basically letting the U.S. and Israel, especially Israel, kind of hang itself with its own actions. So if China were to get front lines involved, all of a sudden it's a much larger war, which becomes far worse and far more unpredictable. But instead, you can just sit back and watch Israel destroy their reputation around the world.
Yeah, and I'll just add a quick note here. There's this kind of talking point that it is a bit Orientalist. So people say, China, they have 5,000 years of history, so they don't think in the short term. They think because, that's obviously kind of exaggerated.
But I don't think all of them are that old, though. 5,000 years.
Exactly. It's obviously kind of Orientalist. But what I will say is that from my experience in different Chinese universities, speaking with people in Chinese think tanks, participating in conferences, Chinese policymakers, they really do think in the medium to the long term. And that's not because they have 5,000 years of history. It's because the Chinese political system is very different. They don't have to focus on these very short-term policies for 2 and 4 year election cycles. The Communist Party can actually make 5-year plans and it can use long-term strategic thinking and planning. And that's what Belt and Road is. They're literally thinking 20, 30, 50 years in the future. Whereas in the US, everything is about this, 4-year campaign cycle. If you can raise money, how many votes you can get, depending on whatever this is. So their system is very different. It actually allows them to be much more strategic.
It's partially the campaign cycle, but it's also because the U.S. is a completely unfettered capitalist system, so everything's like fiscal quarter. I mean, it's basically how can we enrich ourselves in the next 6 months at max? They might plan a year ahead on how weapons contractors can make the most money. There's no planning in the U.S. that ever goes 10 years ahead.
Yeah, and I think just to maybe close on this, it also impacts foreign policy or, imperial policy, because you have the United States as an empire wanting as badly as possible to either expand or maintain its control and dominance over particular regions like West Asia. So we'll do things like very hastily just arm to the teeth Israel, and Israel does whatever it wants. And, now you have the United States in this very precarious position of, no one in the world likes what Israel is doing, but the United States needs Israel to continue to exist in its current formation. But then you have Russia and China. A lot of people, you mentioned, Ben, criticisms, right? A lot of people criticize Russia and China, especially over this very question, over how it's handled its relations with Israel. But I don't think what people understand is that when, especially China, but Russia too, when they engage in these kind of diplomatic maneuvers as they balance the situation, they're not just thinking about, what's happening today, as much as it might be important. We all want what's happening in Gaza to stop. But at the same time, I think, both of you have intimated that neither are interventionists, and interventionism actually worsen the situation. If the axis of resistance is saying interventionism is going to worsen the situation in the region, then I think Russia and China are probably going to listen to them, not necessarily to people who, in the United States, we have a warmongering empire that just slaughters people in a very rapid manner. Yeah, we want that to stop. But Russia and China are looking at, how do we long-term build the bridges, the roads, politically and economically, to ensure that we can actually get there without ending up in some kind of nuclear catastrophe, which is the position that both Russia and China find themselves in, where they have to think about that quite often and quite frequently.
Yeah, I want to make a quick point that's related to that, what you just said, Danny, which is, if you look at a map of the countries that recognize Hamas as a terrorist organization, it is also the same map of the countries that it put sanctions on Russia, it's the West and a few of its proxies. I mean, it's a tiny fraction of the world population. And Hamas, as a political movement and the governing party in Gaza, has political offices, which are basically kind of function as embassies in multiple countries, including in Russia, by the way. And Hamas just participated in these diplomatic negotiations in Beijing. And they participated along with other Palestinian factions like Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, etc., which are recognized as so-called terrorist organizations as well by a small handful of Western countries. The vast majority of countries on earth do not recognize them as terrorist organizations. And there are numerous UN General Assembly resolutions, including 3535, which said very clearly, which reaffirmed that the Palestinian people have a right to armed resistance. And even recently, as recent as this July, when the International Court of Justice made this historic ruling saying that Israel's occupation not only of the West Bank but also of Gaza is illegal, one of the judges, in his opinions, the opinion that he wrote in this ruling, he also emphasized that as people under occupation, the Palestinians have a right to armed resistance. He pointed out that would be within international law, right? So he would say, hostages are not included in that, but attacking Israeli forces that are occupying them, that is absolutely in the right of Palestinian forces under international law. And Russia and China have recognized that. In fact, China's legal representative said the same exact thing in the ICJ proceedings. He pointed out that under international law, the Palestinians have a right to armed resistance. So we should not forget that Russia and China, when they're engaging in diplomacy with these factions in the region, not only in Palestine, but also Hezbollah, other forces in Iraq, Ansar Allah in Yemen, they often their relations are political relations, diplomatic relations, as if they were kind of state-to-state relations. So they're dealing at a level of actual diplomacy, like they would be negotiating with the state of Qatar or the state of Saudi Arabia. They kind of deal with these armed groups in the region. So they're dealing on a fundamentally different level. And ultimately, China and Russia want to stabilize the region. They do not want war to continue. And you're absolutely right that if they were to get more directly involved in any way, it would probably be World War III. Like, no one wants World War III. Maybe like a few crazy war hawks in Washington and Tel Aviv. But outside of them, I mean, people asking for like Russia and China to somehow get more directly involved, it's just utopian thinking. These people don't know anything about how diplomacy, geopolitics, military strategy works. And they're asking for the world to be pushed into World War III, which is actually what China and Russia are doing the most as the actual adults in the room to prevent. I mean, the US is so irresponsible in so many ways. And if China and Russia weren't pushing back and trying to put the brake on, we probably would already be in World War III, given how crazily hawkish everyone is in Washington. I mean, it's not just the Biden administration. It's almost all of the Republicans. It's Trump. It's most of the Democratic Party, almost all of the Democrats. I mean, 95% of people in Washington are basically pushing the world toward World War III. And China and Russia are doing everything they can to put the brake on.
Thank you for tuning in to my latest video. I appreciate all of your support. This channel, however, needs your help. I am seeking to make this channel more sustainable in the long term and upgrade necessary equipment to ensure that this work continues onward and makes progress to give you all of the geopolitical analysis that you all deserve. For that reason, I'm asking you to become a member of my Patreon community at patreon.com/DannyDhaiphong. You can find that link in the video description or in the pinned comment below. For whatever amount you choose to give, just know you are supporting independent media that you can't find anywhere else. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the next video.